Good morning. I'm here today with Steve Dorrance to visit about the book Dorrance More Than a Horseman, which is now in its second edition printing and has been hugely popular in the horsemanship community. Thanks for taking the time to visit with us today, Steve.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a good rainy day, so it's a nice day to be inside for a bit.
That's great. That's great. Well, what do you think is the secret to this book's lasting popularity? It's been so well received by folks, and I know people were so excited about this second edition. What do you think makes this book so special?
I think it, as I have thought through this, that a lot of this has to do with where we are in life when we read something. And so as we gain other experiences, a person can read someone's story, you can just pick it up, open it up randomly somewhere, read a story, and it's going to mean something different when you read it this time than it probably did the time before, for quite a few people. And I think that's, going forward, it'll be that way 10 years from now. And when you read someone's story, you're going to think, wow, okay, that's what I'm working on now. And I'm probably missed that, or I'd got that too. Kind of reminds you. That's what I believe is the importance of the book.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's so, the people that have the spectrum of folks that have contributed to this book, their writing skill and their life experience and their relationship with Tom covers such a huge spectrum. And so it's really unique in just the diversity of voices and experiences. And it's like every person who contributes just adds a little facet to the whole picture.
That's right. I was thinking about first time I'd read it all the way through, and I started A through Z in that direction, and started out with Gene Armstrong's story. And I thought I'd read it a while back, and I was chuckling to myself, and I was thinking that, yeah, even having grown up here, I went through something similar as what Gene did, that wasn't too sure what I was encountering because it didn't have really a basis for it. And of course, for Gene today, it would be different if he was writing that story, I believe. And another one that goes along with that is Joe Morris's story. And I was really chuckling over that and what he was going through, what he thought he was working on at that clinic and really working at it. And then when he looked over there, he realized Tom was taking a nap. Joe needed to kind of go through that soak, and he needed to realize that maybe he was taking it a little bit too serious. And that was what Joe needed to be working on then, but it wouldn't be the same today. But we've all kind of had these human experiences, because most of this is working on ourselves. And then it's amazing how much the horse will fill in when we begin to have the understanding of the horse there. But yeah, I think about the deals in the 60s and trying to kind of figure out just what it was that was being presented, what was being presented then as a language was trying to be developed to describe this, or as Millie called it, a lingo.
Mm-hmm.
The lingo hadn't been wasn't there to even write a book in the 60s, or for people to be able to understand Tom what Tom felt. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but I'll try. My sense is that Tom was someone who was not comfortable with being put on a pedestal of any kind. And yet he is somebody who motivated or sort of sparked desire in a lot of people to sort of reach for loftier goals, not only in their horsemanship, but in people. And so what do you think that, what are your thoughts on that? How the sort of, yeah, I'm not quite sure how to ask that question. There's some tension there between somebody who doesn't want that sort of attention and yet is inspiring these feelings.
Yeah. I'd thought about the time when Tom was talking about it. I'd stopped by there at Gustine to see him, and he had a National Enquirer he was reading, and which was different. He and Uncle Jim, they both read. My dad he didn't read it as much. It was a little harder for him to read. And I got quite a kick out of it, seeing that National Enquirer there. Margaret had picked it up at the grocery store when she'd been there. And there was probably a real story behind, or a pretty good story behind why she'd done it. And he could see that I was eyeing it. And he said that, they'd been doing interviews. They'd wanted him to do some interviews. And he said he'd finally decided that the National Enquirer might get it right. We had a pretty good laugh, and I'm guessing he'd been saying that, and that's why Margaret had bought him one.
Yeah.
He thought the National Enquirer might get it right. But by the time they'd edited everything out that they thought wasn't important, that he thought should have been in there. So, but yeah, he wasn't looking for recognition. And I remember that as a kid. He and Uncle Jim wintered here, from the late 50s up until the mid 1960s. They would winter here, and Tom and Jim, then they'd go back to Battle Mountain when the weather was a little nicer, help out there at Marvel's. And just kind of being around him, he was pretty quiet, real intuitive. He was the guy that could pass you something before you asked for it, but he could tell that you were getting ready to ask for it. Uncle Jim, on the other hand, he was a bigger person, a bigger presence person. So you knew he was around. And Tom was softer spoken. But he was Tom was really observant. And he could see, if something wasn't quite working with the dog, or how we were handling the dog, handling horses. He was really intuitive, and he was always trying to figure a way to kind of set it up so we could do it just a little bit different, I think. And it was the same way, even if it was a project that we were working on, maybe driving some nails in a board, or putting a board up on a fence, or stretching some wire, built some fence with them. And there was quite a few things went on there. But he was real observant, and he remembered. And I remember my dad had talked about that Tom's memory was far different than most people's. And I found that out later on in life, when we'd be visiting, when they'd moved over here in the latter part of 1995 to the ranch. And he not only could remember the day 50, 60 years previous, he could remember the time of day when he did something.
Wow.
And I would chuckle about it because I'd be trying to remember what I did right after I ate my oats for breakfast.
Yeah.
And it was clear. And my cousin had said, well, there's nobody that could verify it. And I said, no, it was true. I could tell because he had that picture. He had a picture. It was just like a film running in his head. He could just call it up. He could see where he was sitting. We were talking about the Wade Tree saddle, and when he was working on the tree there at Hamley's, and where he was sitting, what was up on the walls. And it was just amazing. Just amazing, that type of recall. Yeah. And what I meant to follow up with that story right there was that with that kind of recall, he didn't have any desire that I remember for of wanting notoriety. He wasn't looking for that because he was having all these experiences. He wasn't looking for another experience. He was just experiencing everything. He was, and so a lot of it he didn't have that desire. And I remember Margaret had said that he didn't really desire many material things, but when he did, he wanted the best. And once he got it, that was the end of it. He was done. I remember the day, well, it was a couple of days after the last clinic that he did. And Margaret had been talking to some other people, and they were really excited. They had a few more clinics that they wanted to do. And Tom was tired. He was done. He'd accomplished everything he wanted to do by doing the clinic. And he knew what it was doing physically to him. And he said no. And I was thinking that's right, because he wasn't wanting to do it to the end. He was wanting something else in life at that point. And he just stopped, and it was really hard for Margaret. And there were so many people that were getting things out of the clinics and wanting, he said, no, it's got to be different than that. He said, that's it. And he never did another clinic. And so that wasn't what was driving him. He didn't have that in him that he needed. He wanted that for recognition. He was trying to figure out another way to help out people. And so then the phone calls became really important. And so the people would call, and then he was always kind of trying to figure out how, when he was visiting, that he could help them. And he got better at that. But he didn't ever charge for a phone call. I called it was maybe his entertainment there. And he didn't need it. That's not faulting anybody that does by any means. But at that point, he didn't need anything more monetarily. He was doing all right. He felt like. And and I can appreciate that now.
It's been some time since Tom has passed, and there's still a lot of interest in his work and carrying it forward. How do you feel about that? Is it possible to work in the vein of what Tom was offering without having been around Tom?
Yeah. I think there's enough people out there that have parts of it. And I don't know, of course, people can't they can only experience what's out there in the stories that they hear. And as they begin to do more things, have more experiences with their horses, they're going to need to hear something a little different. And I think there's enough material there that they can get some help. There's enough other people out there that have parts of it anyway, parts of what Tom was, what he felt. There's probably some people that can feel it. Maybe or understand it closer to how Tom understood it. But I've watched a number of people, and I don't do this for a living. I've got a ranch. Family's got a ranch. My occupation's much different. My driving force isn't horses. I really like horses. I think about horses. I feel good when I'm a horseback, but this other part of teaching isn't who I am. But I watch people. I read articles, and a lot of times I can just see, they probably need to have a little different experience. They probably need to go back and maybe watch an older tape. They maybe need to pick up the True Unity book. Maybe pick this book up, just open it up anywhere if they've read it, read another story, think about it, or it's a book like that. I have a book that Tom had me read in I was about 4th grade, 5th grade, somewhere in there. He had me read, he just mentioned that it wouldn't be a bad book if I read it. I think it was a joke. So anyway, I read it and I did a book report on it, and I'm pretty sure the teacher wasn't impressed. And it was J. Allen Boone's book, Kinship with All Life. And I've read it a number of times through the years, and I wasn't there. He'd kind of check with me every so often, and it's not the end all book, but it kind of gives you an insight on what can be. And then I wanted to talk about the can be when what it could be. When I think about it, if you haven't experienced something, if you don't know that it's there, it's very difficult to find it. And that's the value in hearing these stories, having some written material. Now we have some film material, and to get an idea of what the possibilities are, and to get it so you have a more satisfying relationship with your horse. And it's like, for me, I'm not saying a horse isn't going to, I'm not going to fall off a horse again. That's kind of a given. If you're riding, you're probably going to, you have a good chance of falling off over time. But I want to have as good as experience as I can when I'm a horseback. And I don't want to start out thinking that I need to be able to stay on a bucking horse, that I need to be able to keep my horse from running through a barbed wire fence right off the get-go. I want to have a much better experience when I get on my horse. And I believe that that's what Tom wanted, was people thinking, from what I could understand from him, to think that, you could start out when you left the house, before you left the house in the morning, that you were going to have a chance at a good experience. And the horse was going to benefit from that you could be going together. And talking to somebody the other day, and he said, you look at a little kid and they're horseback and the horse is happy and they're the kid's happy. And I said, yeah, I'd kind of almost thought that's what I want to have. And of course, they're not asking the horse to do anything, and they're not pulling on its head, and they're not trying to rope a bull with it or something that requires a higher degree of skill. But to have that type of a feeling that when you were first on a horse and you were going together and the horse's ears were forward, the eyes were energetic, enthused, and there's no feeling like that. And then we forget what that felt like. And then you're putting some kind of gear on them that's, you're trying to skin them up or, kind of beat the horse up a little bit to get them to perform differently. And it's just, that isn't where we started riding. That isn't where I want to be.
Yeah. Like, I can hear that that's important to you. Your feeling about the horse and the horse's feeling about you, and having good experiences, the both of you. And that's not important. It's not a priority for everybody. And
No.
what do you think? Why? This is an easy question.
I was a teenage male for about, till I was at least in my mid-20s. And so there's that exuberance, that maybe showing off, that whatever it is. I don't know what it was for me, but there was a lot of drive. I wanted to do a lot of things. I didn't really care. Wasn't thinking about much past 30, if I made it to 30. There's a whole bunch of us. And I think that's part of it. There's a deal with the gear. And I thought the other day I was at a museum and we'd lost one of Tom's spurs that he'd made. And I know it's Tom's spurs because there's no silver on it. It's a nicely made spur, but there's no silver on it. And then I was giving a talk up at the museum there in Joseph, Oregon, some years ago, and somebody came in there and they said they had a bit that they understood that Tom had built. And I said I'd never seen one that he'd built. I'd seen some spurs. And it wasn't marked, of course, but that was the family story. It was one that Tom made. And I said, well, does it have any silver on it? And they said, no, that's what's unique about it. It doesn't have any silver on it. And I said, well, let me see it then. If it had silver on it, I just, could have been anybody's bid. And when I looked at it and I looked at the workmanship on it, looked similar to the spurs, the few spurs that he'd made. And I said, I think that's entirely possible, because Tom didn't see any need for silver. He wasn't looking for adornment. He wasn't trying to get people to look at him. He was thinking about the functionality of it. And Tom and I had that discussion that, slobber straps on snaffle bits were generally, an old latigo. I didn't know that you could have a slobber strap that didn't have multiple holes in it. And the whole deal was the slobber strap was supposed to break before it hurt the horse. And we talk about things breaking, the horns were all wrapped with an old latigo or something, because, that was just protected the horn. But there's quite a bit of adornment now, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, you want to have a sense of pride. There was one thing about the Dorrances that was maybe a little bit lacking. We weren't very good about taking care of our equipment. We made sure the dogs didn't chew on it. But as Margaret said, we weren't very good about cleaning it. And Margaret was very good about cleaning. There's other people around here that are good about cleaning their equipment, but if you have that bad Dorrance genetics, then you might not get around to cleaning the sweat off or knocking the dust off. You might drag the chain up over the side of the pickup and ding up the paint. That'd really tick Margaret off.
I bet.
But yeah, I think there's that part of kind of wanting to be showy. There's an energy, especially in males, younger males. I'm just speaking from experience, having been around a number of them, to do things a little bit rougher. That's kind of how I did it, even though I knew better. Could see it, and I'm not interested in that anymore. I'm not interested there, because at my age, if I go off a horse, I don't heal up in a month. It takes a year now to heal from anything. Last injury that I had, when that cow got me, finally a cow got me, and I was in there at the physical therapist, and I said, man, this is taking some time. And he said, you have any idea how old you are? This is going to take a year. He said, I'd be out of here in 3 months. I had another guy in worse shape than you. And he said, 3 months, he was doing just fine.
Thanks.
30-year-old wimp. Okay, it's going to take me a year. So it took a year. Took a year to recover from that deal. But yeah, I think that's part of it. I think as you get older, I asked my dad one time when he first got to California in 29, and I said, who did you see that was doing a really nice job with their horses? And he said there was a couple of older Miller and Lux cowboys retired. He said they had quite a bit of age on them. And he said their horses weren't softened up, but they were responsive, and the horses liked them. And I can't remember their names, but he said, I knew they had something different than what I'd been seeing. And so a number of years went along, and I'm driving him one day, and I said, those couple older Miller and Lux cowboys that you remember, I said, how old were they? And he just thought for a little bit, and he said 50. And I said 50. I said, when you said it, I was thinking like 80, 90, 100 years old or something. And he said, well, there was no workers' comp. He said, there wasn't anybody who was going to take care of them. And he said they got to a point to where they couldn't get hurt. If they got hurt, they were really in bad shape.
Yeah.
And so he said that was a factor. They got to 50. There wasn't many of them left.
Yeah.
And he said, like for Tom, he said when you looked at the family, Jim was the oldest boy. He was real strong. My dad was the next oldest. There was 2 sisters, and then my dad. And he said, I was fairly not as strong as Jim, but stronger. Fred, he was a little shorter and pretty good shape. And then he said Tom came along. Tom's just not much anything. In fact, the way he described me sounded like a leppy calf. They didn't expect him to live at the start. And so he didn't end up working as soon as his brothers. And he said Tom, not being as strong and big and whatnot, he couldn't pull those horses around. He couldn't have done that if he wanted. So Tom never had that opportunity in his life to overpower something. And Tom and I talked about it, and he said, yeah, he said, there's kind of an advantage in that. And my dad said that was the reason that my dad liked to work with children and women, because he said they didn't damage their horses like men could, younger men. At that time, it's different. They said, they wouldn't be able to haul them around or power through it, muscle them. And so Tom had that advantage. He had that advantage that he never went through what a lot of young males go through, at least.
Yeah. Well, boy, you've given me a lot to think about, and I wanted to comment about the contribution that you made to the book. There's just some really condensed gems of information that I was underlining as I was reading it, like where you're saying a lot in a very few words, and I think that people will really enjoy reading your section in the book, and I appreciate your writing style is very economical, but very rich. And let's see, are there any stories that you didn't share in the book that you'd like to share with us now, about Tom or about growing up in the Dorrance family?
There's always stories come up for me at different times. And I usually only remember the last one. And I saw a deal, it was last night. I was going through a bunch of papers, and I'm always in hopes that I'm going to get organized. And it hasn't happened. So I'm not expecting it's going to happen. But anyway, I read this real gem of a deal that Margaret wrote about when she and Tom were talking about getting married. I think she sent this, she maybe wrote it for you, sent it to you. And there was 20 years age difference between Margaret and Tom. And she was a little wondering how that was going to work. And he said to her that he promised that he would stay young for her. That's how it would work. And I'd seen that before, but I hadn't thought about it for quite some time. And I was reading that to my companion, Roberta, about it. And she said, then I told her some other stories about things that he would do. And she said that was that part of not growing up, not taking it too serious. And that's what he did. He kept a lot of humor, even right there to the end. And I think that's an important thing, is that you got to have some laughs along the way. You got to have some humor, and not in a malicious way, but you got to be able to tell the story. You got to be able to laugh at yourself. With that, Margaret had a few things, and I remember telling Margaret these stories and reminding her of them, and she wrote a few of them down. And the time when Tom was telling me he'd been in bed, and he said an old Bramer bull was after him, and Tom was pretty quick, and he had really good balance, and by this time Tom had 2 knee surgeries and was wearing hearing aids. Walking with a cane. And he said, anyway, in my dream, this old Bramer bull was after me. And he said, and I was running. And he said, I got to the fence, and he said, I threw my leg up over the top of the fence. And he said, I threw myself right out of bed onto the floor. Woke up, and he said he was laughing. And he said, Margaret just rolled over and looked at him. And she said, "What was so funny?" And he said he couldn't hardly tell her what was so funny. Telling that joke about himself.
Yeah, yeah,
And when you can do that in your 80s,
yeah. That's pretty amazing.
it's the difference of saying, "Man, I'm out of bed on the floor." And all he could think about is how funny it was that
Yeah,
he could run,
yeah.
that he put his leg up over the fence and threw himself out of bed.
Oh.
But
Oh.
I think there's a lot to that. There was a lot of laughter in the Dorrance family when my dad's brothers and sisters were there at the kitchen table. There'd be a gathering every so often, and all I remember were the stories. They'd be telling stories and there'd laughter. And it wasn't malicious laughter. It would be just some funny incident like that. And they'd had a pretty good upbringing from their parents. It wasn't an easy existence out there. It was cold. It was 30 below country. And, but there was a lot of really good times. The family cared for each other. And and they could just have a pretty good laugh over it. I still remember his great grandmother, and she'd passed away, and it was the winter time, and you can't hard dig a grave when ground's froze. You got to build a fire, thaw the ground out. Tom had told me this story. I think about it every so often, especially when I go by the old cemetery there. And so they just put her in a snowbank. The family prepared the body, and then they dug a hole in the snowbank. It was easier to do that than it was to dig a hole in the ground. And then they covered her up. And he said, as a little kid, he said he got to making a pretty big wide berth around that spot in the snowbank. And he'd tell it, and then he'd get to laughing. And you'd think, man, that can really traumatize a kid. Thinking great grandma's buried right there in that pile of snow. But being able to find humor in, an everyday situation, and all the different things with the horses, and the the parents building the place out on Crow Creek, and they'd build it for multiple generations, and finally nobody wanted to be there. And selling it in the mid-40s, and how hard that was for them. And but it's just kind of the reality of families dispersing and having other experiences. That wasn't the last place to live.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of really good stuff, but a lot of good humor, a lot of childlike behavior, trying to stay young enough. And Margaret had said that she'd followed it up, that she aged faster than Tom did. Her hair turned gray, and he still had black hair. Oh, but yeah, just seen it from that different perspective. And no matter what a lot of us do, we won't have Mom or Tom's memory, that amount of recall. So we're gonna see it from this other perspective. And these stories that are in the More Than a Horseman book, we're gonna see it when we read in there. We're gonna see similar experiences that we're having. It'll help us through something with the horse. True Unity is the same way. Tom was the one that told me that he would tell people just to read it through all the way, not think about it, set it down, and then pick it up in a year or 10 years, open it up anywhere and read it. And that's what I do. I just breed at random places. And most of the time I know where to open it up because it pertains to what something I've been trying to figure out, something I've been trying to work on. More Than a Horseman's the same way. And I have a few other books. I do the same thing. I just sometimes just pick them up and it's a random deal. And I'll let you in secret. Of course, I have access to a lot of these books, and I have some in I call it the reading room, where the throne is, where the toilet is. Doctors tell you that that's a bad thing, but I just have a few in there and open up and read a passage. Now, I'm not going in that that's a good idea, but that's what I call them bathroom readers.
Yeah. But if it works for you, that's great.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Well, this has been a lot of fun, and we could probably visit for hours and hours. But is there any question that when you were thinking about we were going to talk today, is there any question that I didn't ask that you wish I would have asked?
No, I wasn't. I think we covered it. I think the part of getting there, for me right now, getting there where I was when I was a kid, when I was on the husky horse, and I wasn't very strong, and he'd take me for a run. And Tom had worked with me on him because he'd raced some husky he had, and the fellow hadn't got along with him for a stock horse, said he wasn't safe. And then Tom was working with me one of those winters when we were moving cows, and I really liked Hosky, other than I couldn't stand around and visit with somebody because he was wanting to go too fast. And then what Tom did there, and getting that feeling there that I had with Hosky, because we were together. He was such a fun horse for me. And then getting it to where Hosky, I was having to dig on him a little bit to keep up with the rest of the crew, because Tom had changed it when Hosky found out that he didn't have to beat all the other horses. That he could do just as good at the back. But I still think, too, when people ask me that don't know much about it, they're having a hard time understanding it. And there's the picture, and it's probably one of my most favorite pictures of Tom. And it's Tom and Bill Van Norman, and they're riding side by side. And I said, I just tell people that that's the way I want it. Is how Tom and Bill Van Norman look in that picture. I don't know how they felt, but I'm pretty sure it felt really good to both of them. And the horses too. The horses look really content. And I said, if a person can just get it to there, that's good enough for me. So, yeah. Well, thank you.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you, Steve. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope we get to visit again about something else in the future.
Yeah, it'll be ramblings if it's me.
Well, that's the best kind of, you're a good storyteller. So I appreciate listening to you, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah. Alrighty. Thank you.
All right. Well, you have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.
You bet.
Okay. Bye.